name is Richard Slaughter. We have the pleasure of Don Beck visiting us in Melbourne from many parts around the world. So Don, welcome to AFI.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here for all kinds of reasons, of course. I've always wanted to figure out what the song "Tie Me Kangaroo Down Sport" means. I still don't know what it means. I like it though.
We don't know what it means
Well,
either.
that's good. That's good.
So we've had a half a day with you this morning where we had about almost half of our students and a wonderfully rich session. The point of this interview is really to try and catch some highlights of your work so that we can use it in future with other students who maybe don't have the chance that we did today to sit down with you. So I wondered if perhaps we could begin by asking you about the starting points that got you involved into this area in the first place.
Well, I was teaching at the University of North Texas, a full professor, minding my own business, bored to tears, answering questions that nobody was asking. And I read an article in the Futurist, April 1974, by a man named Claire W. Graves. First I thought Claire was a woman, then I figured out when I saw his picture, I knew he was not a woman. For sure, are humans prepared for a momentous leap? And I scanned over that and I said, oh, I'm reading here something that I think about and feel about, but I've not been able to articulate at all. And so I called him. And he was living in Schenectady, out a place called Rexford, New York, out in kind of a little farmhouse type deal where he would rear horses. So he said, well, come on out. So by February of 1975, I was on the airplane to Albany, never knowing what I was going to expect. And I got off the plane, and there he was with a Russian fur hat on. I'll never forget it. Tall, angular kind of person, very powerful in terms of his posture and his presence. So we went to an Italian restaurant for food, I remember so graphically, and began to talk about what he had been doing in terms of research. And he validated what I sensed about him from simply reading that article. So that began a long-term relationship. He'd had 5 heart attacks and a case of open heart surgery and some brain damage, and was very precarious and virtually semi-retired. So I said, well, Dr. Graves, we need at least 10 more years from you. So thou shalt not die. And so and that started an interesting relationship. I'd go see him often, and I was doing presentations in the Hudson Valley, Catskill Mountains for Office of Personnel Management. So I'd go see him, and I said, Claire, why don't you go with me? He said, well, I'm not really supposed to travel. Claire, why don't you go with me? He said, okay. So he wrote a note to Marion. Marion, I'm going down the Hudson with Don. I'll see you in a couple of days. Don't worry about me. So off we went to this hotel and did the conference where I would do the presentation, because he just didn't do that as well. But he would hold forth, he would answer questions, and the professor away. And he just loved that kind of attention. So we had a great relationship, and his health got better, and sponsored a series of workshops around the country, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, Dallas. And then because I was working with Braniff International, that was in bankruptcy. So Putnam couldn't pay me in money, he could pay me in airline tickets. So I had airline tickets. And so I could fly he and Mary in various places. And so we went to New Orleans. I'll never forget that experience at Bourbon Street with this patrician from upper New York encountering Bourbon Street for the first time, talking with the New Orleans Saints coaches about why players are using cocaine, because the chemical structures of cocaine intermix with the egocentric CP red system. I mean, things like this were just wonderful insights, and so it was just a very good collegial relationship. I never was his student, of course. I would have my PhD.
Yeah.
But I learned so much from him, and it was uplifting just to be around him and tell war stories and comment about the weather. And he's a huge sports fan, so obviously I am too. So we always had sports to talk about. So that was Claire W. Graves.
So what were some of the key concepts that he came up with that so excited you at the time?
The fact that his models were evolutionary models that looked at steps and stages, I think that really got my attention. I did my own PhD in Oklahoma under Mustafa Sheriff, looking at eco-involvement as a variable that impacts responses. And so that eco-involvement concept fit well with his levels of development concept, because too much of research done on college sophomores simply assume that they're all the same, that they're people. And because with Sheriff we saw the segmentations around depth of eco-involvement in their positions that predicted why some respond in a favorable way and why some push that message into the camp of the enemy. So I was developmentally ready for a segmentation model. And having again been with Sheriff in his autokinetic light experiment and social judgment and particularly psychophysical measuring system, not verbal self-reporting snapshots, which are psychosocial, but looking at how people have filters, P300 waves that shape their perception of a phenomena, as opposed to the brain simply, being an empty blotter, as many of the behavioral theories were saying. And Sheriff was one of the first to work on cognitive domains, because he was one of the founders of social psychology, where that sociology and psychology are seen as the same discipline. And so his focus on cognitive systems also set me up for a lot of the Graves thinking about interior value structures and how they form. So my Sheriff experience prepared me for the Graves experience, which in turn prepared me for more concept versions of that with Ken Wilber and others. So you can see the consistency and the flow of the insights that came starting with Mustafa Sheriff.
So was there a developmental period for you between starting to work with Claire Graves and before you began working with Wilber?
Yes, and that were the 63 trips to South Africa.
Okay. That's very difficult to summarize in a few sentences.
Yeah,
but,
well,
if you could try just to give us the highlights of that.
Well, where I came to grips in the midst of tear gas, the way that in terms of the Graves concept, his levels of existence were in their pristine condition, impinging on each other. It's like all of human history was being replayed right in front of me, from the clans to the tribes to the empires to the holy orders to the enterprises to the communal egalitarian. All those systems were in that cauldron, in that crucible. And that's why this was Graves' favorite project, because we got to field test his entire theory at one time in one place. So that experience of dealing with verticality, with real tribes, real animistic thinking, not a phony version of it, but the real version of it, see how it responds to challenges from other tribal systems, tribal warfare, and how it responds to more complex thinking from so-called First World, and how all that mixed together south of the Limpopo River gave us an amazing laboratory like existed nowhere else on the planet.
So how long did you spend on that phase of work?
I started in 1981 until last year, but the core of it was because my focus was on the original transformation of apartheid. And so when Mandela took presidency in 1994, that was really the end of that major effort, because I tried to get to that stage. Because if we could help that society get to that stage, then maybe we've done them a real service. And so my focus was on that. And with his inauguration there, that really ended my more active involvement. Even though I stayed involved for several years, I wanted to get them to that point. And it was quite an experience.
And you wrote that up in a book called The Crucible?
Called The Crucible, Forging South Africa's Future, which I recommended a 10-year period of national unity, because I'm not that advocate of relying upon one person, one vote models in a multi-party environment, particularly because of the developmental gaps. Because to me the issue was not apartheid, that was not the problem, it was the symptom. of the inability of Europeans out of the Enlightenment to understand Africans coming out of the natural empires and tribes, and the huge gap between them. That's what set in motion apartheid. And so what I was really trying to say to South Africans, that there's yet another framework here around value clusters that break out of the tribal stereotypes, and now the first was stereotypes. And if they could begin to focus on those, then they have the possibility of building a society in a transition phase that could avoid the serious bipolarization and civil war tendencies that existed.
So if I can move on to meeting Ken Wilber and beginning to work with him, how did that synthesis between his perspective and yours take place?
Well, I've been reading Ken's book since his first one, 1978, A Spectrum of Consciousness. And in fact, I showed it to Claire Graves, and he said, this young man knows what he's doing. So I early had an admiration for Wilber, so I would watch each of his books. Because each one added a new layer and level of intensity as he was wrestling with what we call verticality, or systems, stages, steps, waves, levels, whatever nomenclature that we use, that explain how humans have emerged. And because he was stout and bold and courageous enough to say that in the midst of a context jokingly called area code 415, which means San Francisco, haunting him because he had dared to suggest that there is a vertical aspect working in society. So I kept reading those, and I read SES, but not until One Taste, when I read passages where he was talking about Thomas Jefferson and the agrarian system, and why slavery existed at that time, why it seemed to be okay at that time. And rather than pass judgment on it and, in a sense, condemn everything Thomas Jefferson said because he had slaves, that really increased my respect for him. And so I just, one day, I said, I'm going to call him. And without thinking I could ever get his number, so I called Information Boulder 303-555-1212 and asked for Ken Wilber, and she gave me his phone number. So I just called him and told him who I was and what I'd written, and he said, well, the best books I've read sometime, when can you come see me? It happened that quickly. And as soon as I got up there, and he'd been through some serious health problems too, then we just kind of instantly hit it off, and began what is a collegial relationship. I'm not saying that we're personally close, and I don't bother him with emails unless there's something important, and he always responds, so I keep him up to date. And so in those first meetings, we talked at length about spiral dynamics and Claire W. Graves and the research method behind it. And he got this late in writing Integral Psychology. And so he put this into some of the early chapters, as one model among many, and there are many other good models too. But I think because of our experience in South Africa, and because of Graves' very disciplined research, I think that really got Ken's attention when he was beginning to look at the various integral models. And for that reason, he gave us a lot of print in integral psychology, and certainly in A Theory of Everything, is virtually based on spiral dynamics. And so that kind of conversation with him infused into him this language. And I think the simplicity of using colors to represent whole complex human systems, because he writes in a very concrete, short fashion, not elaborating, and not a lot of adverbs and adjectives, writes extremely well. Yet he doesn't elaborate and add in imagery that's not necessary for the clarity of his ideas. So the language of spiral dynamics fit very well with his way of writing. And I just think that the kind of bonding that the two of us reached quickly and real high trust levels made possible. And the fact that he treated me with so much respect and honesty and always gave credit and was always open about it. And that also influenced me in the age of so many rip-offs and
Sure.
People who steal material and don't tell you where they got it and try
Yeah.
to put their name on it. And in every aspect, here's a man of great integrity,
Mm.
and I really honor and respect that. So that's the story.